Now that I have my 2 zippers centered and inserted, so this is going to be my front and my back, and then I've done the exact same step on my small pocket and my contrast band. So I should be on the step where I'm going to lay these pieces together. Again, being mindful of where my zipper pole are. So these are going to be over at the top. I want them to be at the same side. So your instructions tell you to center the zippers right on top of each other, right sides together. So here I have my right side, and all I'm going to do is line up all of these seam allowances with the raw edges, and then my 2 seam allowances that go on either side. Smooth out my fabric. And I'm going to place a couple of pins around just this side to hold it. I don't want to pin this side because what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew at a 3/8 line, and I'm going to fold this down, and then you'll see this will become the contrast band and the front pocket. So I'm just going to pin along this edge right here. I will be using my quilting bar, and I'm going to measure 3/8 from the seam allowance. So here's my seam allowance. This is where I'm going to be sewing. I do need to use my quilting bar because I have this piece I won't be able to see. So I've already taken off my presser foot. That was for my zipper. I've put on my regular presser foot. I'm still on regulation stitching, so I'm going to stitch at 3/8 down here. So with my quilting bar at the 3/8 and with my presser foot back on, my regular presser foot back on, I'm going to sew from edge to edge all the way down, 3/8 from that seam allowance. So not from the zipper, not from my stitch line, from that edge of the fabric. That is why it is important that you serge that as straight as you can, because we are going to use that as a guide. Back stitch. End, back stitch at the end. I can remove that pin. I'm going to trim my threads as I go. So now I've just backstitched 3/8 away from that seam allowance. I'm going to take this, and if I've done it right, these 3 edges should all line up. But I also have this edge that I need to take into account. So I'm going to fold all of my edges and sew all of these together. And if these line up and if I've sewn everything right, my zipper should be right at the fold at the top. However, if I just sew all 4 of these corners and that zipper is closed, that is extremely difficult to get inside. So before I do that, I'm actually going to open this zipper up, so when I fold it down and sew it shut, I can actually still get inside and turn the bag right side out. So I'm going to leave that open almost all the way. So I'm lining up all 4 layers. I have my front, my contrast, my pocket, and the back. Smoothing it out just to make sure, because I am sewing on 4 layers of fabric. I don't want any bumps, any puckers or tucks. I don't need my quilting bar. I should be able to see the 5/8 line. I'm going to start at the very top, and I'm actually going to fold my zipper tape and my seam allowance down. So this is going to be pretty thick. So I'm going to do it with a little bit of caution as I stick it in. I want everything to be folded down so it'll lay flat. I'm lining up the edge with my 5/8 seam allowance. I'm going to sew, really make sure you backstitch at this top part. And then I'm going to reinforce the corners because I'm going to push them out. So before I get to that 5/8 line, so the 5/8 line that runs across the bottom of my stitch plate, the very bottom, I'm going to drop my stitch length down to a reinforcement. And then I'm going to rotate, still at the reinforcement. And then I'll go back to my regulation stitch. So I've just reinforced the corners. I'm going to do the same thing at this other corner before I get to the 5/8. I'm going to drop my stitch length down to reinforcement until I get to 5/8. Pivot, still on reinforcement, and then go back up to regulation stitch. Now before I get here, I just want to make sure that all of these seam allowances are still pushed down. So on the back side it's pushed down, on the front side I can see. If I need to, I can lift my presser foot and make sure they're laying flat, and that presser foot will help hold them down. So I have my zipper unzipped so I can actually pull this whole thing right side out. But first I need to take it over to the serger, and I'm just going to serge down, across, and up. Finish these off. I'll trim my threads, and then we'll trim the corners. So I ran it through the serger and I serged the 3 sides that I just sewed. Because I have this open, I will be able to flip it right side out, but before I do so, I need to reduce the bulk in these corners. This is a lot of fabric. It's going to come to a fine point in that corner, a 90-degree angle. So I want to reduce the bulk down there, and then I want to reduce the bulk up here. What I'm going to do is take my scissors and very carefully cut these at an angle, taking care not to cut through my stitch line. I have reinforced the corner with that reinforcement stitching, so I'm not as concerned with there being a hole right there, and that is one reason that we always want to reinforce our corners. If we have to trim them to reduce bulk, which we usually do, we want to make sure that we've got strong stitches there. And I am cutting off my serging, so don't be afraid to do that. I'm just trimming this. I trimmed it across and then at an angle. Don't get crazy with this. I'm just trying to reduce how much fabric is going to be in there when I flip it. At the top, I'm just going to cut at an angle. Again, taking note not to cut through my back stitching that I did when I stopped sewing. Now I'm ready to turn this right side out. You may think you are done, but you do have one last step. A lot of times we will get students who will turn in bags that look something like this. And even though they've got the techniques of their zippers and the reinforced corners and everything looks good, you want to take note that you get those corners all the way out. That is part of completing a quality garment. So here I have a point turner that I'm going to use, and I'm just going to push that corner all the way out. Again, another reason that we reinforce those stitches until I have almost a 90-degree angle. Because it is pretty thick, it would be really hard to get that to come to a point, but it looks pretty square considering I have 4 layers of fabric in there. So I'm going to do that for each corner. You may be tempted to use something like scissors because they come to a point, or your seam ripper, terrible idea. Those will cut right through your stitches and through your fabric. So you want to use something that has a point but is not sharp. And I'm just pushing out all 4 corners to have the shape that I sewed them to have. So that is our completed bag. We've got our 2 centered zippers. We have our pivoting both at the bottom and the top. This one was done with a contrast band and a contrast back. And that is your sample that you will turn in.